one of her earlier commercial appearances, and were struck by how naturally she carried herself on camera. The production was searching for someone to play Jia, a young deaf girl who forms an extraordinary bond with Kong himself. The filmmakers didn't want an actress simply performing deafness for the role. They wanted someone who lived it. Kayle, despite having zero major film experience, walked into the audition process and left an impression that was impossible to ignore. Her natural expressiveness, her fluency in sign language, and the honesty she brought to every scene made the decision, in the eyes of the filmmakers, obvious. Landing the role of Jia in Godzilla vs. Kong, released in 2021, changed everything for her. Jia is written as an orphan member of a fictional island community with a deep connection to Kong, and much of the emotional core of the film rests on the relationship between the two of them. That is no small task for any actor, let alone one making their feature film debut. Kayle had to perform many of her scenes opposite empty space or stand-ins, since Kong himself would only be added later through visual effects. That kind of acting requires enormous imagination and trust in a process most adult actors still find difficult, reacting with fear, affection, or wonder towards something that isn't actually there and won't exist until a visual effects team builds it months later. She handled it with a level of composure that impressed both her director and her fellow cast members, several of whom later spoke about how unusual it was to see someone so young adapt that quickly to the demands of a massive studio production. Part of what made her performance land so effectively was the way the filmmaking team chose to treat sign language on screen. Rather than reducing Jia's communication to subtitles that hearing audiences could skim past, the production leaned into ASL as a real, expressive form of storytelling in its own right, letting Kaylee's hands, face, and body carry entire scenes without a single spoken word needing to fill the silence. That approach only worked because Kayle wasn't performing an approximation of deaf communication. She was using the language she had grown up speaking her entire life, and audiences could feel the difference between authenticity and imitation. When the film hit theaters, audiences and critics alike singled out her performance as one of the most memorable parts of the movie, in a summer blockbuster filled with skyscraper-sized monsters and city-leveling battles. Reviewers pointed to the quieter scenes between Jia and Kong as some of the most affecting moments in the entire film, giving a monster movie an emotional center it might otherwise have lacked. For a first-time actress with no prior film credits, that kind of reception was extraordinary. It also meant something bigger than one performance. It told Hollywood, in a very public way, that deaf actors could headline major productions and connect with global audiences without a single spoken line carrying the emotional load. Kayle returned to the role in 2024's Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire, proving that her breakout wasn't a one-time moment but the start of an actual career. Coming back for a sequel showed that she had earned the trust of a studio willing to build a franchise around her character, and it gave her a chance to show growth as a performer the second time around. Between the two films, she worked closely with actress Rebecca Hall, who played her character's adoptive mother in the story, and together they built a family dynamic on screen that audiences responded to just as strongly as they did the Kong scenes. The films also made a point of presenting American Sign Language not as something exotic or unusual, but as a completely normal way for characters to connect, even having Kong himself learn small signs to communicate with Jia, a detail that stuck with a lot of viewers long after the credits rolled. Off-screen, Kaylee's success carried weight far beyond box office numbers. Deaf children and their families saw, for the first time in a movie of this size, a lead character who communicated the way they did. Advocates for deaf representation in entertainment pointed to her casting as a genuine step forward, not just a symbolic gesture. She became, without necessarily setting out to be one, a role model for young deaf performers who now had proof that a major studio would build a story around someone like them. That kind of visibility matters in ways that are easy to underestimate from the outside. For decades, deaf characters in mainstream film were far more likely to be played by hearing actors performing deafness rather than by deaf actors living it, and even when deaf performers were cast, they were rarely given roles central enough to anchor a franchise as large as this one. Kaylee's casting reversed that pattern in a very public, very commercially successful way, and it gave industry advocates a concrete example to point to whenever the conversation turned to authentic representation. She didn't have to give speeches about inclusion to make the point. Her performance did that on its own, in theaters around the world. As for what came next in her career, there was clearly more on the horizon. People who worked with her described her as someone with the range to move beyond big-budget action films into dramas, family movies, or other kinds of storytelling. She was still a teenager balancing school, family life, and a growing profile in the industry, all while staying close to the deaf community that shaped her. She continued attending the Texas School for the Deaf, and by all accounts remained grounded despite the attention that came with being part of one of the biggest movie franchises in the world. That future was cut short in the early morning hours of July 21, 2026. Kaylee was riding as a passenger in a car in Ijamsville, Maryland, along with two other people, when the vehicle left the roadway and struck a culvert. Investigators with the Frederick County Sheriff's Office believe excessive speed played a role in the crash. Emergency crews arrived at the scene at around 3 in the morning. The driver of the vehicle, a 19-year-old man, was taken to a hospital with injuries that were not considered life-threatening, and the other passenger in the car declined medical treatment at the scene. Kaylee's injuries were severe enough that she was flown by helicopter to a regional trauma center for emergency care. Despite the efforts of medical staff, she could not be saved. The news broke publicly when Kaylee's father, Joshua Hottle, shared the devastating update with his community in a video posted online, speaking in American Sign Language about the daughter he had just lost. He described having to fly across the country to claim her body, and spoke about the disbelief and heartbreak of losing his child so suddenly. Her mother also shared her own tribute, expressing how proud she was to have been Kaylee's mother. The following day, the Maryland Medical Examiner's Office confirmed that Kaylee died from multiple blunt force injuries sustained in the crash, and officially ruled her death accidental. Tributes poured in almost immediately from people who had worked alongside her. Legendary Entertainment, the studio behind her Godzilla films, released a statement honoring the heart and humanity she brought to the role of Ja, and expressed their condolences to her family. Co-stars including Rebecca Hall, Dan Stevens, and Millie Bobby Brown shared their own personal tributes, remembering her talent, her kindness, and the warmth she brought to every set she worked on. Deaf actress and longtime advocate Marlee Matlin also spoke publicly about Kaylee's impact, recognizing what her casting meant for deaf representation across the entertainment industry. Advocacy organizations for the deaf community echoed similar sentiments, describing her as someone who had become a genuine and passionate supporter of deaf actors trying to break into Hollywood. The Texas School for the Deaf, where Kaylee was still enrolled as a senior at the time of her death, released its own statement to students and families, calling her passing heartbreaking news for the entire school community. For a school that had watched her grow from a young student into an internationally recognized actress, her loss was felt not just as a public tragedy but as a deeply personal one, affecting teachers, coaches, and classmates who had known her long before Hollywood ever came calling. A GoFundMe page was also set up to help support her family during an unimaginably difficult time, drawing contributions from fans around the world who had never met her but felt the impact of her work regardless. Kaylee's story attracted a wave of attention online in the days following her death, with fans and outlets trying to piece together everything about her life, including questions about what she had earned during her brief but impactful career. The honest answer is that very little has ever been officially confirmed. Legendary Entertainment never disclosed what she was paid for either film, and like most young actors working on major studio productions, her exact earnings were never made public. Some entertainment and celebrity finance websites have floated unofficial estimates of her net worth somewhere in the range of $100,000 to $300,000 at the time of her passing, but these figures come from outside estimation rather than any confirmed source, and her family has never commented on or verified any specific number. It's worth being clear about that distinction, because in the wake of a tragedy like this, speculation can spread quickly, and the Hottle family deserves accuracy, not exaggeration, attached to their daughter's memory. What's not up for debate is the impact she made in the time she had. In just 2 films, Kaylee Hottle didn't just play a memorable character. She opened a door in an industry that had rarely given deaf performers a chance to lead. She proved that authenticity resonates with audiences more than spectacle ever could, even in a franchise literally built around 1,000-foot-tall monsters fighting in city streets. She gave young deaf viewers a chance to see themselves as the emotional center of a story instead of a side character, and she did it all before she was even old enough to vote. Her passing has left a visible hole in the community that raised her and the industry that had only just begun to embrace her. But the impact of her work isn't going anywhere. Every time someone watches Godzilla vs. Kong or its sequel and sees Ja signing with quiet confidence, sharing an unlikely bond with a giant ape who somehow understands her better than most people do, that impact is still playing out on screen. Kaylee Hottle's career was short, but what she represented for deaf actors and deaf audiences everywhere is something that outlasts any single film, any single role, or any number attached to a bank account. She spent her short life proving that talent doesn't need to be translated into spoken words to be understood, and that the biggest blockbusters on the planet are stronger, not weaker, for including stories like hers. If there's a fortune worth talking about when it comes to Kaylee Hottle, it isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in every young deaf viewer who watched her on screen and, for the first time, saw themselves as the hero of the story. That's the legacy worth remembering her by.